Brendan Kane, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to connect with you and everybody that's tuning in.
Yeah, definitely. It was awesome getting the opportunity to meet with you in person. We were working together at a summit in Bucharest, and I found your presentation was awesome. It touches on a lot of the topics that I touch on in the podcast, but dives really deep into it. And you have a great plethora of experience in working with some pretty big name brands on the topic we're going to dive into today. But before we get into that, maybe you can give us kind of a high level overview of who Brendan Kane is and what you do.
Well, at a high level, we kind of reverse engineer communication and virality predominantly across social media. And what that means is we really look at the storytelling structures and patterns that are working and also not working to kind of understand how we best contextualize the message that we want to get out into the world. And I've been on this journey. I started in social media in 2005, so a little over 17 years. Started it back in the days of Friendster and MySpace. So if
Tom?
yeah, friends with Tom. Uh, so I've kind of tested and explored every aspect of social media over the course of that time frame.
Yeah, that's I used MySpace back in 2005 to promote my band, and it was actually really good at that time. Not being a music platform that it is sort of today, but definitely was using that, and obviously Facebook when it was emerging in probably 2006 and 2007. So, in what capacity were you using the platforms back then to market?
Well, I started in the film industry, so it was all about how to leverage these platforms to promote the films that I was working on. Because at the time, social media wasn't really a thing, and a majority of marketing for the film industry was television, print ads, radio, kind of the traditional aspects. And just saw that nobody was really paying attention to these networks. However, there was plenty of traffic there. So, really learning and experimenting of how to capitalize off these audiences and communities that were being built to effectively generate awareness for the movies that the team or the studio that I was producing and I was working on at the time.
Tell me about the journey to getting to that point to working in film. Was this something you've always been sort of driven to doing? Is doing this marketing aspect behind the scenes for the films that you worked with? Like, how did that all transpire?
Well, I initially wanted to produce films, and I went to film school and quickly realized they didn't teach you anything about business in film school. And I felt that in order to understand producing, which is a big part of it is business, that I needed to learn about business. And I thought the most effective way to do that is starting your own. And the most cost efficient way at the time was to start online businesses. So while I was going to college, I started creating online companies just to really learn and experiment. And when I moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in producing, like everybody else, I started at the bottom. I had to make coffee, copies, deliveries, things of that nature. And I'm a big proponent of figuring out different ways to stand out from the crowd. And I just realized the people that I wanted to connect with, which was the heads of the studios, directors, other producers, when they would ask me, why did I move to LA? And they said, or I would say that I wanted to be a film producer, I could see their eyes glaze over because I was one of a million uh, of with this pipe dream of becoming a producer. So I had to take a step back and really identify, well, what would be a good hook point to stand out. And I just noticed that in the studio, every time we finished a film, there was a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety because we just invested tens of millions of dollars into a single piece of content, and we were going to invest tens of millions of dollars to promote this single piece of content. And it's not like any other industry where you have years or decades to build a brand. You're literally creating a brand in a matter of months. So you need hundreds of millions of people around the world to know about this piece of content you produced. And I just went to the head of the studio and said, I know we're spending on the traditional avenues of marketing. Let's test out marketing through these online traffic sources, predominantly social media, for a fraction of the cost, in some case, no cost at all. So I think it was like 2007. I was working on a movie, and I did the first YouTube influencer campaign because I just saw an influencer wasn't even a term at that stage. I just saw all of these video creators building an audience, just made a list of the top ones and messaged them and say, "Do you want to interview a movie star?" And created collaborations that way. So that's how I got into it. It was more out of necessity to kind of stand out from the crowd and forge the connections that I wanted. And I just realized working in the studio system, it was a lot more corporate and political than I anticipated. And I just continued down that journey of social media because it was more entrepreneurial and exciting to kind of create and test and learn to see how these things worked.
So you saw an opportunity and a need and went all in on it. I think that's I think it's very interesting and very brilliant that you found it that way. I used to want to be a music video director, and then I realized there was not a lot of money in that. Your chance of making money was very slim. But you sought out the opportunity because you're doing something you love, which is working in film, but now adding that business aspect onto it and the way to sort of monetize that intel, right? Or monetize your intelligence within that field of marketing, right?
Yeah, I didn't even really look at it from a monetization standpoint. I looked at it from the standpoint of how do I forge the connections at the higher level so that I could be seen and uh, just bolster those relationships to see what was possible. I think that it was still for at least the first year and a half was still about how do I forge the connections to produce films, and then it just started to grow into more of the social media and the marketing side of things.
Which makes building those connections that much easier. Now, that's a good segue to how did you get in a position where you had the pleasure of working with the likes of Taylor Swift, Rihanna, MTV, NHL, and IKEA?
So while I was working for the first studio that I had a job at, I was analyzing social media, specifically MySpace at the time. It's when MySpace was acquired by Fox and News Corp, and I wanted to understand how are they going to really maximize the investment because at the time it was a big investment. It was like 600 or 700 million dollars, and at the time that's a big number. Today it's not that big, but I want to understand how was Fox going to make back that investment that they made, and I just noticed that they were relying on banner advertising, which at the time the CPMS are super low. I didn't really see kind of that ability to get the return on investment that they made. But what I noticed was that people were sharing Nike posters, movie trailers, these things, and it was the most valuable form of advertising was peer to peer sharing of this content, and yet MySpace wasn't making any money out of it. So I came up with a prototype that the head of the studio invested in, which essentially was really like the first ever influencer technology platform where individuals on MySpace could insert these media assets and get a cut of not a cut, but they would be rewarded financially if their friends engaged with it. If they watched, they clicked, things of that nature. And the intent was to do a deal with MySpace, and we had a few meetings with them, and it just didn't work out. And we ended up, after meetings with lot of larger corporations, brokering a licensing deal with MTV. And we did a lot of successful tests with MTV, but we just noticed it was just too early. There wasn't enough scale because, again, at this time, influencers didn't exist. There were
Mm.
people that were accumulating followings, but the concept of the influencer market, and brands paying them just wasn't there. So I ended up building another technology platform that could dynamically write code for you at an enterprise level. So you could start from a blank white screen and kind of design anything that you wanted, and our system would code it. So I licensed that again to MTV, and that relationship opened up the doors to work with a lot of the mainstream celebrities and artists and athletes and things like that.
That's awesome. That's amazing because I mean having that resume of some pretty profound media um, media hubs or outlets or businesses or influencers like Taylor Swift and Rihanna is a pretty awesome resume to have. Can you speak a bit about the um, how you worked with the NHL In what capacity?
So we were having conversations with the NHL about that second technology that we built with MTV and exploring, and it was kind of the same conversation we were having with MTV as you're building these stars and they weren't really maximizing the revenue from it. So like if you think about MTV, they would have a Taylor Swift on their network or Rihanna or any of these
Mm.
musicians, build them into global superstars, and then they didn't really share in any of the upside of that revenue. So that's where we were exploring the opportunity with MTV and the NHL about helping them build more of a digital and e-commerce presence online, kind of building that, launching it, and helping them manage it, and then sharing in that revenue.
Did that spiral to other opportunities within that niche?
Um, I mean, it did not specifically in that niche. I think that every conversation that you would have would spiral into different business opportunities, but not necessarily in kind of that specific niche. I've always kind of just looked at what are scalable systems, models, infrastructures that can be applied to any industry. So that's where it kind of always shifted into other opportunities and in other sectors, business sectors, industries like that.
You never really did niche your agency at all, right? You kind of work with pretty much anyone and everyone.
Yeah, and that's created a lot of opportunity, but also, as you know, from a marketer, it creates challenges. I just really love learning about business and kind of like to explore different opportunities and learn and things of that nature. So it presents pros and cons. You know, there's the pros is anybody can be your client, and the cons are anybody can be your client. You know, so it's just kind of the way that I've gone about it. It does present some challenges, but it's fascinating and interesting at the same time.
It can be challenging being a chameleon, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's one thing we never did either, was niche down. As much as at times I'm like, man, this would have been just so much easier if I only had to really do all this research in one industry. But on the light side of that, on the brighter side of that, it's like, well, hey, I get to learn about a lot of different types of things and be an expert in tons of different types of niches, which is kind of cool as well. But I think my team might disagree though. But so let's talk about 1 million followers first of all, because I mean this is one book I was going to say couldn't put down, but I listened to the audio version of it and I couldn't stop listening to it. I thought it was a great book. But if you could sum up that book in 1 minute, tough to do, but how can somebody best and most easily get to 1 million followers?
I would say it's understanding how to contextualize your message in a way that stands out. That's and it's not a sexy answer, but these platforms are built on effective communication. When I first started in social media, there's a few million people on these platforms. Today, there's about close to 5 billion people on social media, and they're all producing content, and you're fighting against the same attention. And social media has shifted the dynamic of marketing where the traditional mindset of marketing is I have to compete against my direct competitors. Today, you have to compete against every content creator on the planet to grab attention. So that's where it makes it extremely challenging to stand out. So anything on social media can go viral. Any subject matter, taxes go viral, insurance, real estate, nutrition. It doesn't matter the subject matter. What matters is how are you expressing that information in a way that is going to break through that clutter, rise above the noise, grab and hold attention so that you can get your point across and get people to know, like, and trust you.
Has anything in that book changed as we approach 2024 with the emergence of AI? Is there any revisions you would make to that book, or do all the same theories within that book still exist?
The core premise of the theories all still exist. We have updated with new kind of theories and new concepts in my second book, Hook Point, and we're working on a third book right now. But everything in that book still works. There's little nuances and tweaks and things of that nature, but it's really the core principles are still relevant.
It just makes me wonder, with more and more AI tools emerging, more and more influencers talking about how they're best using AI. It just sounds to me like it's just making it more difficult for individuals to potentially stand out in a noisy environment.
Well, there's definitely a lot of noise. I don't know that AI makes it more difficult. I think that AI gets misinterpreted in a lot of ways. AI is a tool to use. It's not a replacement for creating content. I was just at a conference and there was a really unique guy that used AI to grow a big audience. But the reason that he grew a big audience using AI is he was using AI as the hook to build the audience. So AI is a very powerful tool, but it's not like a replacement that's just going to fix all your problems for you and just grow you a massive audience. Kind of the analogy I use is if everybody woke up tomorrow and started using AI to produce social content, well, everybody can't go viral, everybody can't stand out. It's
Mm.
your expression and use of that tool that will allow you to kind of break through or not.
Just I mean, obviously on the SEO side of it, it makes things probably a little more challenging for SEO companies like ours to get our content to stand out with just the amount of content, the volume of content being churned out there. And you got to think, obviously, social media channels and algorithms are going to be inundated with more content as well with this. So that's where the challenge comes in, because we're all fighting for limited inventory or limited real estate on social media.
Yeah, to me, I mean, the way that we look at AI and the way that we're exploring it is the value of those tools are only as good as your input, because if you don't have good input, you're not going to get good output. And I think that and I'm not an expert in SEO, but the way that I understand social media is the thing that controls reach and distribution of content is the algorithms. And the algorithms really only care about one thing, and that's user retention, meaning the longer somebody spends on the platform, the more ads they can serve, the more profit they generate. So they're always going to value and distribute content that grabs and holds attention longer than other content. So the algorithm will determine whether your content is seen by 1,000 people or 10 million people. And what they're really benchmarking you against is how effective is your content in that retention graph holding the attention versus other content. So yes, it may get noisy, but it's always going to favor the content that's better at storytelling. And that's
Mhm.
again where there's going to be some, and there already are some people that are doing amazing jobs with AI and using it in really unique ways to tell compelling stories. But most of the people, 99.9%, are just going to use it to create garbage.
Mm.
It's the same thing, like, if you think about book publishing, when self-publishing became a thing, I think that there's now like 7 or 8 million self-published books a year. So it lowered the barrier of your ability to put a book into the world. You no longer need a publisher, but the majority of those books are garbage. Just because you have the ability to do something doesn't mean you're going to do it well. And I would assume the same applies for SEO. Now, I don't understand the algorithms at a high level perspective, but I would assume, the search rankings and the algorithms that look at that are probably going to value the quality of that content and how people engage and interact with it.
Well, exactly, and that's where Google came out with a recent update, the EEAT, which essentially prioritizes content based on the trustworthiness and expertise of the content created. Right. So, and to your point, it's like, sure, all this content might be getting churned out there right now with the help of AI, which is great, but it's just creating a higher bar and increasing uh, user retention, enhancing user experience, right? Because now the bar for good content is going to be up here, and then that's the content that's going to be shown to more people and get more reach, and probably it's going to eliminate the need, or not the need, but the effectiveness of stock photography, for example, right? Which is just basically probably not going to be prioritized at all in the algorithm. But moving on to talking about something you touched on in Bucharest at the summit was the hook point predictive viral content model. Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, so it's a proprietary model that we've built, and the way that the reason that we built it is we wanted to set a foundation for a creative process that could work no matter what change happens in social media, whether a new platform comes, an old platform dies. And the core crux of that model is research. So, what do I mean? Uh, well, one of the biggest mistakes that people make, well, there's two big mistakes people make as it pertains to social media. One is they're solely focused on the quantitative data, meaning they look at views, likes, shares to determine success or lack thereof. And it's a good metric of determining if something succeeded or failed. But where it falls short is it doesn't tell you why something worked or didn't work. It just merely tells you it worked or it didn't work. So that's a big mistake because people just look at the data and say, oh, that worked, that didn't work. But they don't understand, like, if it did work, how do we reproduce those results? If it didn't work, they don't understand how to fix the problem. The second issue most people look at is they're only looking at their own content, their own data. So let's just say that you have an account and your average video is getting 1,000 views a video. Well, if you just keep looking at your own content, how are you going to find the answers to push it from 1,000 views to 1,000,000 views a video? You won't. You're really going to struggle with that. So, where we come in is we focus on the qualitative analysis of content, the real why behind it. So, what that means is when we look at like 50 different performance indicators in analyzing content. So, it's anything from like tonality to facial expressions, body cues, number of edits, first 3 seconds, captions, title cards, to understand what are these contextual elements, what are these qualitative elements that drive success versus detract from success. And we're not doing it with our own content in the beginning. We will once we start getting performance, but we're looking at the larger social media ecosystem. We're looking at who's having success and how are they having that success. And the way that we do that is we look for very specific storytelling formats. So, one thing I want to kind of define is what's the difference between a trend and a format? Because a lot of people talk about trends in terms of social media. Well, trends is something with a shelf, like an idea, a type of
Mm.
post, a concept, and it has a short shelf life. It only lasts for a short period of time. Versus a format is a storytelling structure, storytelling patterns that can last for years or decades. And if you look at the most successful content creators on the planet, as it pertains to social media and outside of social media, they focus on a singular storytelling format and they master that. They become world class at it. They don't shift every time they create a post, they don't chase trends. They get into a single format. So, for example, and there's hundreds of these formats across each platform, and each platform has different formats. So, one example is like the man on the street format is a successful format in social media, meaning somebody approaches somebody on the street and does something with them. So I have a friend, Alex Stemp. He's got about 22 million followers on TikTok. He's a photographer that approaches random strangers on the street and offers them professional photo shoots. That's his format. And he's used that for 3 or 4 years to build an audience of 22 million people. So that's a singular format. Now, the interesting thing about the man on the street format is there's people using that to generate 10 to 100 million views a video. And then there's people using that same format that only generate 1,000 views a video. Well, what's the difference between the two? And that's really where our process starts is let's define the specific format that matches the message that we want to convey to the world. Then once we have that format, let's look at the high performers versus the low performers and identify what are those performance drivers that are happening in the high performers that are not happening in the low performers.
Let me stop you there just for a sec, Brendan. In terms of the format, how important is it to remain consistent with that format for a user? Like, does your friend, would he deviate away from that format to create other types of content, or will you stick with the format that you know works with every single piece of content?
You stick with the format until it stops yielding results because that's a big, and when I say stop yielding results, it means that you've successfully used it for a period of time. Because the issue becomes is most people will try a format like man on the street, it won't work, and then they're like, "Oh, I need to move on to the next thing." But if you think about it, like I started in the film industry, every movie uses the same 3 act structure in terms of how they tell their stories. Whether it's horror, action, comedy, drama, they follow this same 3 act structure. Now, what's the difference? Well, there's these qualitative elements. And you've probably heard of filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, like some of the best filmmakers and storytellers of all time. When they create a movie, they're not reinventing the 3 act structure. They're using that over and over again. And that's what allows them to become world class storytellers because they're using this singular format and then understanding how to express that format and use it for their story. So same thing applies here. It's kind of the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours is if you are just constantly, most people don't even think about social media from a format perspective, but if you're just constantly chasing a trend or not don't have a format or you're constantly changing your format every time you create a piece of content, then how are you really going to master that art of using it and a master of these social platforms?
To dive into the psychology of that, why do you think that is? Do you think it has anything to do with the simple fact of that talking about, how to stand out in a 3-second world? It's like a user will see that piece of content and they'll be retained longer than that 3 seconds because it's familiar. Would you agree with that?
I don't think it's because it's familiar. I think it's because it works. Is when you sit down to watch a movie, unless you've gone to film school, you're not saying, "Oh, there's the inciting incident. There's plot point 1, there's plot point 2, there's the climax, there's the resolution." It's that storytelling structure works. It engages you in a way that takes you on a journey. Now, when people see the man on the street format, and like we've done research on like 7 or 8 different expressions of man on the street. There's different expressions of it, but it's not there's them sitting there saying, "Oh, this is familiar, so I'm going to watch it." It's the way that the story unfolds that causes us to stay with it.
And what's equally important is probably the main character or the creator of that content, because that man in the street format might not work or mesh with every type of personality, right?
Yes, and that's why when we've probably analyzed over 100 of these formats. When we work with a client, we find a format that works with them individually. But with even within that format, there's people that use that format where they're featured in it. There's people that use that format where you only hear their voice. There's people that use that format that you don't even hear their voice. You're just capturing an interaction. So again, even within that structure, there's so many different ways to express it.
So the main point here is just the consistency of that format for the user, right?
Well, I don't think it's about consistency. It's about mastery
Mm,
because people throw around this word consistency. Consistency is a way to scale, but it's not really. Also, same thing with frequency.
mm.
It's like I'm not going to say that there wasn't a point in time in social media where that did mean something. Like 10 years ago, when there's less content on the platform, and these platforms were just looking for content to make sure that when people were logging on, they had something to consume. But now, because there's billions and billions of pieces of content they can serve to you, they're not going to serve you something just because you're consistent or you're frequent. And it's, you talk about consistency is just because you do something every day doesn't mean that you're going to get good at it if you don't really understand the principles
Mm.
behind it.
Yeah, you can be consistently shit at doing shit content, so you're just gonna be consistently shit,
Yeah,
right?
and it's interesting. And film has shifted a little bit, but when I started going to film school and things, is like you couldn't just go make a movie. Like you had to convince somebody to give you the money, or you had the equipment, and they wanted to make sure that you knew how to tell a story, you had a good
Mm.
screenplay, and all of these things. Versus you look at social media, you can just pull out your phone, click record, and post something. So the barrier of entry is so low that on some level people think social media is so easy, and then when they get into it they get frustrated that nobody's seeing their content, and then they blame like the algorithms are suppressing my reach on purpose to get me to pay, or I have to be a big celebrity or all these other things when it really is another art form to master.
When speaking of the hook point viral content model, in your presentation, you explained how you would look at 50 to 100 different pieces of content. Talk about how you kind of not measure what works and what doesn't, but how you analyze that data.
Yeah. So again, we have a process that's called gold, silver, bronze, and
That's
we
it.
take one of these formats. Like let's just take man on the street again, and what we'll do is we'll do it on two levels. We'll go one creator, like maybe an Alex Stemp, and look at his high performers, then his average. So for him, a high performer is probably 50 million plus views a video. Average one maybe in like the 5 million, and then the the underperformer, the bronze, is probably 500,000 to a million. And what we're doing is we're cross analyzing what's happening in those high performers that's not happening in the the average or the underperformer. So gold is high, silver is average, bronze are underperformers. So, for example, one of the things that we've just seen a lot in Man on the Street, not just with Alex, but the reaction of the person that you're interacting with is critically important. Because obviously, if you're reacting with somebody that doesn't have an interesting or charismatic or over the top reaction, it falls short. But then there's nuances of how much do you feature yourself? When does that first interaction come? How do you build the tension of the end result of that interaction? So there's these different nuances, and the way that we come up with the answers is really closely looking at what's the difference between a high performer and a low performer. Now, sometimes we'll go a second step and compare Alex's use of that man on the street format with another channel as well that may be severely underperforming to kind of see what is the difference between that. Or sometimes we'll do that with a client if they are wanting to do that man on the street format. Is once they understand these qualitative elements and nuances of comparing what they've done to one of his high performers. Now, the important thing is when we're doing this analysis, we're not really paying attention to the content itself, but the context. So Alex approaching random strangers on the street and offering them professional photo shoots, that format can be used for any subject matter. There's another influencer, I think his name's Vic Blend, that does the exact same format, but he offers them haircuts like he's a professional barber. So you start seeing that these, because most people get so literal and they look at Alex and be like, well, I'm not a photographer, so how can I learn anything from that? But when you look at it from the lens of the qualitative elements of storytelling structure, the patterns there, those learnings can then be applied to any social platform, or I mean, to any industry or subject matter.
I think that's fascinating, and it's it's interesting because we did not on that level, but we do a lot of white papers and lead magnets, and we've dissected the data to find what are the top lead magnets that produce the lowest cost per lead, and it was similar across the board, and we created a framework for it. But I just don't think not a lot of marketers look at the underperformers to understand the reasons why they underperform. They're just so fixated on what works and creating more of what works. But I think you can get a lot of learnings by comparing the two.
Absolutely. I think that that's where the patterns really emerge, because if you just compare high performers, maybe you'll see some patterns, but the real patterns emerge when you look at the high performer versus the low performer. And again, we don't just look at one high performer, one low performer. We'll look at 5 or 10 videos of each gold, silver, and bronze to kind of find those patterns.
Now, just going back for a second, you spoke about measuring facial expressions and measuring tonation, especially during the first 3 seconds of a video. What are some big takeaways that you do see there? Is there something that stands out?
Well, let's talk about the first 3 seconds. One of the biggest mistakes people make is they try and do too much. So they'll have captions going, they'll have a title card, they'll have somebody talking or moving, and really those first 3 seconds are really just to set an expectation. You need to create a clear visual hierarchy of where you want them to pay attention. But if you have like captions, title card, somebody talking, and people are trying to register, well, where do you want me to focus? And this is happening subconscious, and they feel like they're getting left behind, then they scroll past. And the minute somebody scrolls past, that's a signal to the algorithm. Obviously, you're
Mhm.
not holding attention, so they're going to suppress your reach right away. So that's a big mistake that people make, is not understanding that there's a clear visual hierarchy of like, what do we want to convey in the first 3 seconds? And that doesn't need to be a lot. Most people over engineer that. Um, it can be somebody, you know, taking a certain movement. It can be a title card, it can be a caption, but it's got to be a clear visual hierarchy that doesn't overwhelm the person from either a conscious or subconscious level that causes them to move on. Another big mistake people make is not really standing out with kind of their hook, because if people think they know what you're going to say, even though you have a different perspective, they're going to move on as well. And that happens a lot with content, basically in every sector, because most people have consumed content from multiple different industries, and if they feel like they know what you're going to say, you're going to move on. To the second part is, you know, your facial expressions, your body cues, all of those things send subconscious signals to the individual kind of person. So again, going back to the format perspective, is you can't just throw anybody into a specific format with understanding the personality that's driving it and understanding the patterns of how you effectively communicate through those patterns. So we have a communication algorithm that kind of looks at this at a deeper level. So we have a access to a proprietary data set that's got 1.5 million communication assessments done worldwide. And what it shows us is that people connect with your content, connect with your brand in 6 different ways. And it's broken down into to essentially a mathematical formula. So the largest subset of the population, 30%, connects or disconnects from your content based on how it emotionally makes them feel. They want to emotionally connect with your content in you or your brand. The second largest, 25%, is fact based. So for them, it's not about how it makes them feel. They don't care about that. They want it to know, does this make sense to me? They want data, information, who, what, when, where, why. Does this make sense? 20% is reactive. They're not thinking, they're not feeling. Is this going to be exciting? Can I react to this? Is this, is this stimulating in some way for me to grab my attention? 10% is reflective based. So they're reflecting on the world. So the best analogy I can give you is, if you ever read a biography about Albert Einstein, he would stare out the window for hours and then reflecting on the world around them. So these people just take in information and reflect on it, and they typically like to be led by you telling them what to do.
Mhm.
Um, 10% is values and opinions based. So for them, it's, do I trust what they're saying? Do I value what they're saying? Are they dedicated to me as a consumer, as a viewer? So it's really, do my values and opinions align with the person or the content or the information that's being shared? And then the smallest subset of the population, 5%, is action based. So for them, they want the bottom line, they want to move fast. So if you've ever seen Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise, he's not thinking, he's not feeling, he's not having fun, he's running. He's jumping off the side of buildings, hanging off the side of planes, he's just going, going, going. So when we think about creating content and communicating, we are going to communicate based upon how we perceive the world. Now, we have access as individuals to all 6 of those communication styles, but we predominantly communicate from our strength and don't really use the other 5 that are our weaknesses. So, as you can imagine, is if I'm thought based, fact based, and I only use facts and logic, and I ignore emotion and fun and imagination and all these other ones, I'm only going to be connecting with 25% of the population. So that's where the subtlety of facial expressions, body cues, the words that we use, the phrases that we use will kind of allow us to connect or disconnect. So most people communicating through content or any form of communication is typically only connecting with 30% of the population. So they're alienating up to 70%. And again, it has nothing to do with the content. It's the way that we're expressing that content.
Mm. That that would differ, would it not, on each social media platform? Like a LinkedIn user is consuming their content different than an Instagram user.
It doesn't for this because if you think about it, if I'm feelings based and I connect based on how things make me feel, it doesn't matter whether I'm using LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, I'm still going to perceive this content based upon how it makes me feel. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go over the top. Like to give you an example, we were working with Keller Williams, the real estate company. Gary Keller brought us in and we did deep analysis of like, what does the residential market look like? How do people effectively promote listings? And what we saw is it's pretty formulaic. It's here's a house, here's 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and an acre of land. Now, what is that really playing to? It's playing to the logic part, 25% of the population. So if I were to use this model to broaden that out to connect, it may sound something like this. I'd start with the facts and logic. This house has 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and an acre of land. But imagine yourself sitting around this fireplace on Christmas Eve. How are you going to feel when you're opening up presents and sharing this experience in this beautiful home with your family? And did you check out the pool in the backyard? You are going to have the craziest and funnest parties, and all of your neighbors are going to be super jealous because you're going to have the best house in the block. And I believe that this is a great opportunity for your family because it's in one of the best school districts. So, will you schedule an appointment to view this? So, I took the same subject of a house. And I didn't go over the top in different directions, but I started with the facts and logic of it's 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and an acre of land. I worked in the imagination by just saying imagine, but then I dove quickly into the feelings of how is it going to feel sitting around this fireplace on Christmas Eve opening these presents. And then I quickly went into fun and action by saying how you're going to have the craziest and funnest parties and all your neighbors are going to be jealous because the action people want the best. They want the bottom line. And then I ended it with values and opinions by saying I believe, and by saying I believe connects with them because it's in the best school district. So if you notice, I took the same context of this house, but just diversified the language to make sure that I'm connecting no matter how that individual perceives the house, perceives me, perceives the world.
How did that format, do you know how it's worked for agents? Have you seen agents deploy this format, and has it been successful?
For the agents that deploy it, yes. But like anything, it takes practice
Mm.
to get good at. I mean, they don't talk about it, but Pixar uses this in all their script writing. So if you watch any Pixar movie, like if you think about Inside Out, the movie with the different characters in the girl's
Mhm.
head, there's always a character that is designed to speak and connect with how somebody perceives the world. And that's why Pixar has had tremendous success with their films and content.
That's brilliant. There's a great example from your presentation as well, where the example is a visual metaphors format, and where you showed an example of a lady explaining something, and she had an aquarium in front of her. I believe it was an aquarium with some turtles. Maybe you can explain, how does that visual metaphors format work?
Yeah, so metaphor format again is just another storytelling format like Man on the Street. This one works really well for short form. TikTok, it works really well. Instagram, it works. And the account that we broke down is a clinical psychologist named Dr. Julie Smith. And she's breaking down these abstract subject matter around PTSD, anxiety, panic attacks, things of that nature. And the visual metaphor format includes a few different elements. One is taking a very abstract or complex subject matter, but then leveraging some type of visual metaphor to express that complex subject to kind of distill it down into simpler terms by using this visual metaphor, and then speaking through some type of dialogue. Either you're on screen, you're not on screen. The visual metaphor plays an important role in that. For example, one of her high performing videos is she has a waste paper basket on the table and it's filled with crumpled paper. And she's talking about anxiety and this waste paper basket. And she goes through the analogy of using it of what trauma therapy looks like is you're taking out those crumpled papers, flattening it out, so instead of this overflowing basket, you have these neatly folded papers and then you put it back into the waste paper basket and it's no longer overflowing. So you're taking a very abstract and complex subject matter and distilling it down through a visual metaphor that people can really wrap their head around. Now, again, one of the exercises that we did at the summit is this format has high potential, very successful, but it doesn't mean everyone works. Like in the summit, we did an exercise where we played a high performer versus a low performer from Dr. Julie Smith. So it's the same creator, same exact format. It's just there's these little nuances that caused the one video to get 12 million views and the other video to get 130,000 views. So again, it's most people will look at a visual metaphor format and just be like, oh, I see what she's doing. I know what to do. I'm just going to reproduce it without really understanding what's the difference
Mm.
between using that format successfully or unsuccessfully.
I've seen ads work really well, and even maybe organic content where somebody could be talking about a concept such as selling a house, but they're peeling an orange at the same time. It's just like it's not necessarily a visual metaphor by any means, but it's almost just like something that stands out because it's just, why is this person peeling an orange? And why am I still
Yeah.
watching this video? you
But the
know?
interesting thing was, or the interesting thing would be, is I'm sure people have seen that and tried to duplicate it and it doesn't succeed. And
Mm,
marrying the two of like, well, what happens? Because people may just see, oh, if I peel an orange, it's going to be successful. And they say that's the performance driver. When in reality, it may not be the performance driver. It may be some element of doing it. Again,
mm.
going back to visual metaphor, people may think, oh, if I just use a visual metaphor, it's automatically going to succeed when there's all of these other elements that are going on that dictate the successful use or lack thereof of it.
It's brilliant. It's been an awesome conversation, Brendan. If our audience has any questions for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
They can go to hookpoint.com, check out, there's a video, they can schedule a call with our team. They can reach out to me at LinkedIn. But those are probably the best places to start.
I think some of the best places to start would be picking up 1 million followers and Hook Point, Brendan's 2 books. They're great reads. Go and check them out. Brendan, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.